Hi, and welcome to week 3. Before I begin, I'd like to inform you that the brilliant award-winning film Shoplifters that we'll be watching excerpts of in class is available at Dawson Library's e-movie collection Criterion On Demand. As most of the movies that we'll be watching throughout are, here's a preview.
Hey. どうしたの？ママは？
それ食べさせたら返してきなよ。
今日外寒いんだよな。
シャシャだね。
ねえ、誘拐だよあれ。どう見ても。
めっちゃ可愛いじゃん。選ばれたんかな、私たち。
ユリが映ってる。
児童相談所が三重警察署に連絡したことで。
おお。まずいな。これまずいよな。
家族になりすましていた人たちが一体何を目的にこの家に集まっていたのかは未だ謎に包まれたままの状況です。
子供に万引きさせるの後ろめたくなかったですか？
俺他に教えられることが何にもないんです。
子供にはね、母親が必要なんですよ。
産んだらみんな母親になるの？いやほら、血が繋がってない方がいいってこともあるじゃん。
Now, this week's class will have its first part in a lecture you're watching, Me, which provides you with some critical reflection questions alongside your reading, Chapter 2. Then our class will be spent on more interactive formal and cultural analysis, ending with assessment quiz. To review from last week, since it is what we will be doing throughout the term, the analysis of form in cinema. What is formal analysis again? It's an analysis that dissects the complex synthesis of cinematography, sound, composition, design, movement, performance, and editing of a film. Ooh. Also to consider and to remind ourselves that every shot is made up of frames, and every scene is made up of shots, and every movie is made up of scenes to form a cohesive whole. Next is to consider camera angles and how they inform our perception of a story. The low angle shot, which happens quite often throughout Juno, as you saw in your textbook, and you will see when you watch it next week. And this is done to make the audience look up at the subject. And in this angle, we see them as strong, noble, or threatening. If I start kind of looking down at you, although probably not possible with my webcam. And the next slide will show you some more examples of camera angles I want you to consider.
When we talk about camera angles, we mean the level and height of the camera in relation to the subject being photographed. Most shots in most movies conform to the way we normally see the world, which is eye level, either a sort of average eye height or on a level with the subject's eyes. But, as with most elements of cinematic language, by diverging from this normal view, filmmakers can convey information, meaning, mood, or state of mind. And the conventional effect of camera angles, like most cinematic language, references our real-life intuitive reactions to visual information. In other words, the viewer identifies with the lens. A low angle is what you get when the camera is lowered to shoot up at the subject. If you're looking up at someone who is either bigger than you or standing over you in a position of power, how are you likely to perceive them? As powerful, right? Maybe even threatening. So when the camera looks up at a subject and you're seeing and intuitively identifying with that camera's point of view, the subject often appears threatening or powerful. But not always. A low angle is also a view we associate with looking up at a statue of someone impressive or an important person on a stage. So if presented in the proper context, a subject can be made to appear not threatening, but superior or noble, or more heroic when seen from a low angle. This effect is reflected in an expression used to describe people we admire. I look up to her. Or sometimes the disorienting effect of an extreme low angle can be used to convey a character in a moment of weakness or confusion. The exact opposite of the angle's conventional interpretation. It all depends on the context, our understanding of the subject and situation going into the shot. For example, there's a famous scene in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, in which a character, Wendy, discovers that her husband, Jack, is insane, which is a drag considering that she and her little boy are trapped with him in an isolated, snowbound, haunted hotel. Not exactly a powerful or threatening subject is Wendy. And yet Kubrick chooses to shoot her most vulnerable moments from a low angle. Why? It all boils down to context. By shooting Wendy's moment of realization from a low angle, Kubrick places the evidence of Jack's insanity, his typewriter and his disturbing manuscript, in the foreground, making them large and significant, especially in relation to poor Wendy's terrified little head in the middle ground. But more importantly, the low angle increases tension by denying us the chance to see what's behind Wendy, just at the moment we're expecting psychotic Jack to slink up behind her. This shot from Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, also shows a very vulnerable subject from a low angle. But unlike The Shining, in this context, the low angle increases suspense by allowing us to see what Frodo does not. The high-angle camera looks down on its subject from the same position of power that the subject occupies in the low angle. So the meaning is reversed. Now we're identifying with the camera's point of view, looking down on the subject, who appears smaller and thus weak or vulnerable. Whether it's a guy who really has to take a leak, or a guy who's just been dumped by a princess, or a woman succumbing to the effects of poisoned coffee, or the wife of a heartless control freak, or a kid placed in the care of a heartless capitalist, or a kid placed in the care of a serial killer, or a hobbit placed in the care of a heartless magical ring, or a different hobbit stalked by a heartless giant spider. Weak or vulnerable, that's the conventional meaning of the high-angle subject. But just as with all things cinematic, there are exceptions. This shot shows two not very vulnerable, not weak spies at the moment spy number 1 announces his plans to toss an extremely vulnerable double agent from an airplane. In this example, the high angle's meaning has nothing to do with the on-screen subjects. Instead, it visually references the potential fate of their victim. An extreme high angle, also known as a bird's eye view, positions the camera directly above the subjects, creating a disorienting viewpoint handy for shocking audiences or presenting an unnatural or strange situation, such as being murdered by a cross-dresser or the aftermath of a vigilante rampage. When it comes to conveying unnatural situations and disoriented states of mind, the camera angle of choice is the Dutch angle or oblique angle, same thing. This angle intuitively conveys that something strange is going on by slanting the camera's level to change our usual horizontal and vertical viewpoint into something more diagonal. The audience's point of view now feels off balance, which is just how the filmmaker wants you to feel as you experience an evil genius and his mad scientist partner reanimating a corpse, or a drugged protagonist attempting to escape an asylum, or a city where the normal rules of law and ethics do not apply. And those are your camera angles: high level, low angle, high angle, bird's eye view or extreme high angle, and Dutch angle.
Now that you've been able to see some of the camera angles that are very useful and what they add to the story, again, the formal elements adding to the content, let's look at another technique, parallel editing, which also happens in Juno. And it's a technique of alternating two or more scenes that often happen simultaneously but in different locations. If the scenes are simultaneous, they occasionally culminate in a single place at the end where the relevant parties confront each other, but not always. And here's a clip from Thelma and Louise, which we'll be getting to later in the term.
I'll get it! I got it!
Hello.
Hey, how you doing, little housewife? Y'all packed? We're out of here tonight.
No, wait now. I still have to ask Daryl if I can go.
You mean you haven't asked him yet? Thelma, for Christ's sake. Is he your husband or your father? It's just 2 days, for God's sake. Don't be a child. Tell him you're going with me. Tell him I'm having a nervous breakdown.
They don't care much weight with Daryl.
You at work? No, I'm calling from the Playboy Mansion. Okay, right back.
So in this parallel editing sequence, we can really see the difference between Thelma and Louise, and we get the kind of different moods, feelings, and the situations of each character, which will then come to unravel throughout the film. You can see that through the camera angles that are used, the editing, of course, and importantly, the mise-en-scène, right? All of the elements that are arranged and organized in the frame. Now that we've gone through this, let's think about form and content. Pretty important, we touched on it a little bit. So content is the subject of an artwork, right? What it's about, and provides something to express the story, what's happening in it. And the form is the means by which that subject is expressed and experienced. So this supplies the necessary techniques and methods to present the content to the audience. And the two terms are often paired because works of art need them both. They need the form and the content. Without one another, there's no artwork. And I wanted to show you another video that I think explains it very well with some examples. It's also another video from your textbook.
Form and content are terms that you hear often in almost any scholarly discussion of the arts. But what do they mean, and why are they so often paired up? At the most basic level, content can be defined as the subject of an artwork. In other words, what the artwork is about. Form is the means through which that subject is expressed. Another way to look at it is, content is what the artwork is about, form is how that meaning is presented to the viewer. The two terms are often paired because works of art need them both. Form and content are a team. They depend on one another. Content provides something to express. Form supplies the methods and techniques necessary for us to experience it. And form doesn't just allow us to see the subject, content. It lets us see that content in a very particular way. It lets the artist shape our particular experience and interpretation of that content. In the world of cinema, form is cinematic language. In other words, the tools and techniques that filmmakers use to convey meaning and mood to the viewer, such as lighting, camera angles, focal length, editing, moving camera, proxemics, mise-en-scène, and sound. In other words, the content of most of this DVD and textbook. If we consider the Juno scene analyzed in Chapter 1, the content is Juno in the waiting room. We could be more specific and say that the content is Juno thinking about fingernails and changing her mind. The form used to express that subject and meaning includes decor, the Dalian, juxtaposition, patterns, implied proximity, point of view, and sound.
So the relationship between form and content is central not to just our study of movies, like we saw with the Juno example, But the relationship is an underlying concern in all of art, and an understanding of these two intersecting concepts can help us distinguish one work of art from another, or to compare and contrast the styles and visions of different artists approaching the same subject. Now, in form and content, let's think about the narrative form now, right? We were thinking about the formal techniques of cinematic techniques. Now we'll think about the narrative form, which you can see here is a typical paradigm of a film. And this begins with Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 with plot points in the middle. And we'll go through this more in detail in class, but think about it this way. We have Act 1, which culminates with plot point 1, which is where the movie really begins. Plot point 1 is where the protagonist is going about their regular kind of life, find something happens to them which changes their life, and now they have to figure out how to solve what happened or figure out how to get through it. And Act 2 is all the ways in which they have obstacles in their way to try to achieve their goal. And almost all films in all kinds of ways narrative films have a protagonist that needs to reach their goal, and there's all kinds of obstacles in the way. Then we finish Act 2, the kind of meat of the movie, with plot point 2, which is when the character realizes and is able to confront their problem and either maybe figures it out or is not able to achieve their goal. That depends. And the resolution is Act 3, where we wrap up a lot of the things in Act 1. And we'll go through this more in detail. And almost all movies follow this narrative structure, even some experimental ones. It may not be timed exactly like your structured worksheet has, but they do. Try it out on any movie. Now, we've learned to expect that most movies start with a kind of normal world, which is altered by a particular incident, as I said, plot point 1, that in turn compels the characters to pursue a goal. So once the narrative begins, those expectations provoke us to ask predictive questions about the story's outcome. Questions we will be asking ourselves repeatedly and waiting to have answered over the course of the film. From the late 19th century onwards, most of us get our stories, our narratives and myths from TV, from cinema. And we have turned to the cinema as entertainment, escape, and education as an affirmation of the way we live or think through our lives. And even if we just think of this movies as entertainment, why and how does it do that? And why and how do we need to be entertained? Specifically, within this story world that I mentioned. Now, one way to consider and analyze our need for entertainment and the way that we create relationships with characters in the movies is thinking around cultural analysis, right? This is what our course is called, Cinema and Culture. So I wanted to bring up a brief definition of cultural studies, which is an interdisciplinary, so that means that it requires kind of many disciplines to come together, kind of field of study that emerged in the 1960s from a range of subject areas, so including sociology, anthropology, literary theory, to examine relations of culture and power. And this is really key, that it cultural studies that examines the relation of culture and modes of power. We talked a little about representation before, so cultural studies provides an analysis of those things. So let's go back to form and content. Culture is the form and content of ourselves in relation to our community, our country, our social and economic class, our entertainment, our politics, our identity. I can go on and on. Example, from the toothpaste we use or the fact that we use toothpaste at all. That's culture. Culture is more than ourselves. It's also made up of general ideological components. Which are what? The web of beliefs we take for granted that rule and organize our lives. Culture is the way we act out ideology. Have you ever come across this term before? It's a really important one for us studying cinema. Ideology is an unconscious system of beliefs belonging to a particular class or group and the forms in which people become conscious of the world. the way we agree to see ourselves, to behave, and to create the values of our lives. In other words, it's a kind of system, ideally, it's a system of beliefs that we act out and that we don't question. That's when dominant ideology comes into play, and how culture is intertwined with that. And this can be such as how we're judged on the way we act is based on the ideologies about who we are, right? How women are supposed to act, how men are supposed to act, how certain people of color are supposed to act. We can see that in stereotypes on screen. And in today's film, Shoplifters, how poverty is traditionally portrayed in the media is based on ideologies around poverty or poor people. Now, to consider how cinema is part of these normative values we agree to struggle against, embrace, what would be an ideological assumption? Well, an ideological assumption is that America was discovered by Columbus in 1492. Now, the notion that America was discovered as if it was this unknown place kind of provides a superiority of a civilization that justifies colonialism and imperialism, as if people who are already indigenous to the area needed to be found. Or, for instance, that people are born male or female and then become a man or a woman. That's an ideology. Such as only women can give birth, or Asians are funny sidekicks. There's a whole plethora of these, and we can definitely discuss these in class as we started to last week. So can you consider a film that critiques and interrogates some of these ideological assumptions? Now, it's super important that we understand film history and culture to understand the conventions and forms and how of ideology and how values changed over time. And films do change over time, right? Because their makers have a history. They belong to specific cultures in specific times where some things are seen one way or seen another way. Although despite all this, the structure of the stories have pretty much stayed the same, which is really intriguing. And so this is to consider, I already asked you this earlier, is provide an example of a film in which it is evident that culture and ideology have changed over time. Maybe there's a film from a long time ago that presents certain kind of gender roles or racial roles. I'm sure there's plenty of examples you can find. So when we're thinking about culture and ideology, how does that tie in? Well, we do a comparative cultural analysis, and that analyzes movies more as cultural artifacts than as traditional works of art. So cultural analysis searches beyond a movie's form and content, although that's important and it uses it, but it goes beneath that to expose the implicit and hidden meanings that inform our understanding of cinema's function within popular culture, as well as the influence of popular culture on movies. So we can think about the role of class in Juno, consider that for next week. One form of cultural analysis is feminist analysis. And this analyzes movies again as cultural artifacts and specifically at their depiction of various modes of gendered intersectional identities. So feminism is not just concerned with ideas of gender inequality, but battling cisnormativity, heteronormativity, ableism, of course, racial issues of white supremacy, and that kind of feminist analysis often critiques these dominant modes or these dominant ideologies that reinforce the things that I mentioned, such as racism, ableism, transphobia, etc. And one example would be Juno and its treatment of pregnancy. And we'll consider all of this much more in detail in upcoming classes, as this may still seem sort of abstract. So I asked this question last time. I'm asking it again to consider. And here is the reflections, 7 sort of key concepts, ideas that I'd like for you to take note of and to think about for our upcoming class. And the rest of the slides we will consider in class, but I'm leaving them again as a preview of what is to come. Thank you and see you in class.
Filmmakers can use patterns to fool and surprise us.